Hello, this is Bruce Fehn, and I'm here to talk with teachers about their experiences with teaching the racial history of the United States or uh, race in our contemporary situation. It's a platform on which we can begin to understand what's involved as teachers, in some cases, receive significant pushback on their efforts to talk about race in schools. I'm very pleased to have talking with me today is Nicholas Covington, and Nick was a teacher at Ankeny High School, and I'm eager for you to hear his story. So, Nick, why don't you introduce yourself, tell us a bit about your background, and we'll get right into it and hear from you about your experiences in Ankeny High and why you ultimately left your teaching position, okay?
Certainly. Yeah. So my name is Nick Covington. I taught high school social studies at Ankeny High School from 2012 to just June of this year, 2022. And yeah, I should I just dive right into the the old story here?
Yeah, why don't you do that, and we'll loop back and hear more about you as the interview takes place.
Okay, okay, for
It's an
sure.
important and interesting story, so please go ahead.
Yeah. So what is really interesting is that thinking about it in hindsight, really the genesis for me stepping out of the classroom in 2022 actually began in January of 2021, even though at the time I didn't realize that these events were connected, right? But for the first time, in my career in January of 2021, I got called into a meeting with my admin at the time, and they said that they had gotten an anonymous phone call or something, and it said that in a conversation in class, I had called all Trump supporters Nazis, and that I had directed students to my social media accounts where I had said the same things. And I just remember, kind of if you've ever been involved in like an admin meeting before where maybe discipline or something like that is perhaps in the line, the time between getting the email, kind of the cryptic meeting about such and such a thing, to then actually having the conversation, your brain is just racing, right, with every conversation that you've had with students or anything that it might be. So I was going just through the list. I was racking my brain trying to figure out like what in the world had gone, what had happened here. We had just transitioned semesters. We had just started semester 2 there at the end of January. And I walked in this meeting. I was just like, yeah, what's going on? And when they told me that, I remember just leaning back in my chair like this and just laughing because I was just like, this was not anything that I had expected it to be. I expected it to be about grades or, some missing assignment or something else. Um, because that's where my headspace was. And the other reason I was kind of taken aback is just because it was absolutely not true. I never said that, and I never would say that on my social media. And the latter part is especially falsifiable because you could just search for anything, where I would say that on, say my Twitter account, and you'd be able to find that. Of course, it doesn't exist. So that was a real easy thing to kind of diffuse, is just to say, no, I never said that. No, I never would say that. And it took me a long time to even figure out post that conversation what it was that they were talking about. But what that anonymous phone call, and I never learned if it was a parent or a student or in what context or what class or whatever. But what they may have been referring to was the fact that in the wake of the January 6th events of January 6th, 2021, of course, as a social studies teacher, I was teaching economics and AP European history at the time, right? Kind of pausing on January 6th and then in the days that followed to discuss those events, to watch live, to debrief and process what had happened on that day, from a variety of different perspectives, and then, of course, follow impeachment hearings and all of the fallout that kind of came throughout the rest of that spring. So, in the course of that, right, I tried to use a variety of like non-American perspectives because I think too often U.S. media sources can get caught up in that partisan battle. I didn't want to be perceived as being particularly partisan because I used CNN's coverage or Fox News's coverage or the New York Times or something. So um, I forget the actual source of this now, and I don't want to say because I don't want to get it wrong, but it was actually a UK source who had been at the January 6th rally. I think they had just been at the rally on the Capitol Hill, to save the vote or whatever the original purposes were, and then had followed the protesters and the rioters and then the would-be, insurrectionists into, the Capitol and had talked to them there. And so I thought this was a good clip. It's, not traditionally seen through the binary partisan lens of American media. It's kind of an outsider perspective on what's happening here. And in that conversation, there was a man who appeared on camera, big long hair, if I recall, a beard, and he had this shirt on that had like the death's head skull, and on the bottom it said Camp Auschwitz. And I remember because we were watching that clip and I paused it. And this was in my AP European history class, I believe. And so I just remember saying, like, hey, hold on. What is that shirt supposed to mean? Camp Auschwitz. Well, it turns out that guy on the back of the shirt, later on, you see this, and this came out in news reports that followed. It actually on the back said staff, right? Implying that this would be, a camp guard or something else, like someone who is part of the machinery, of the Holocaust or encouraging this kind of behavior. So all I did, thinking back on this now to prompt this parent complaint or this anonymous complaint, was point out that there's a guy at the January 6th rally wearing a Camp Auschwitz staff shirt and kind of pondering the implications of that, right? Like, what is this guy's motivation in being in the Capitol with this shirt on in particular, Um, and for me, that was just kind of like I'm providing historical context. I'm just doing history teacher stuff. Here's this big unprecedented historical event. Let's try to talk about all the implications of it. Nowhere, right, did I connect, and say that all Trump supporters are Nazis or any of those kinds of things, right? Just to point out that one of the guys there had this Camp Auschwitz shirt on, little bit, a little bit sketchy. Wonder what his intentions are. So, oddly enough, it wasn't until like the end of January. So we're talking like 3 or 4 weeks later that phone call actually in that meeting had occurred. So it had totally even spaced my mind that could have been a possibility. Now, make a long story short, let's fast forward a little bit to later on that same spring. So usually when I teach my AP European history class, nationalism is usually framed in the context of the 19th century nationalist movements, in Italy and, in Germany to, unite Prussia and all the other places, all the history stuff, right? So I do that, but then I also take a look at issues in modern nationalism. And so we kind of take a 30,000-foot view. I don't know, you'd call it like thematic or a conceptual view of like, what is nationalism, right? And so we look at the different types of nationalism, ethnic nationalism versus civic nationalism, kind of where those things are in practice today around the world. Like, we look at Egypt and we say like, okay, is this a civic nation or an ethnic nation? We look at Poland and we say, is that an ethnic nation or a civic nation? We look at the United States and we say, are we an ethnic nation or a civic nation? And kind of compare those things. And then we just look at a variety of perspectives on that issue of what it means to be an American. Because I figure even though this is an AP European history class, like I'm teaching students in Iowa, we're going to have that American context at the forefront. So, right, we just look at a lot of primary sources and some things exploring that issue just to kind of get them thinking from that framework. What does it mean to be an American? And then we explode that into the issues in modern nationalism context, where we then say, okay, so if we're asking that question of ourselves in the United States through the lens of civic nationalism and what it means to be an American in a civic nation, well, what does it mean to be French? What does it mean to be British or English, however you want to frame that, right? What does it mean to be, and we apply that to European countries today because, lo and behold, there are issues in modern nationalism. They're having those same kinds of questions, and those manifest in events like Brexit. So Brexit for several years was the focus of that work because it was an ongoing kind of current event that was happening there, where we could say like, what are the pros and cons of Brexit? What are the leavers saying? What are the stayers saying? How does Scotland fit into this? Like all sorts of things, right? And then we would look at France because France had kind of its own issues with modern nationalism. What does it mean to be French? Like, do you have to be a white French-speaking Catholic, or can you be, due to France's history with colonialism, right? Can you be an African Muslim, right? Still maybe native French speaker, who lives in Paris, and are you French? Like, do people look at you and do they see France in you? And in fact, they had their own far right movement with Marine Le Pen, as she was a stone's throw away from the presidency more recently. So again, very ironic that those are two topics that I would bring up, and they'd since kind of fallen through their conclusion. But let's see. We also went to Eastern Europe too, because I was aware of nationalist movements in Poland, just some of my own experiences, and also just kind of an area of interest there. But right, they're having to address that issue of immigration and globalization too, as they deal with the fallout of the Syrian civil war and the refugee crisis, kind of as they come up through southern and central Europe. Hungary is a big part of that too, but Poland. Right, again, like, are you a white Polish speaking Catholic in this ethnic nation? What does this influx of immigrants mean or threaten the identity of Polish people, and what does that mean to be Polish? And in Ukraine as well, right, as Russian nationalism and Ukrainian nationalism kind of clash, there's a rise of the far right over there, right? So anyway, I'm getting too in the weeds on this, but basically we would just take a few days and look at all these different issues in modern nationalism and just bring it back to that question, like, is nationalism a unifying force? Is it a dividing force? When and at what points in time has that been true? Is it true today? How about back then? Like, what was Bismarck engaging in? Are there equivalents of that kind of stuff today? What about Cavour in Italy? So we're making these big historical connections. I found the unit very worthwhile. But then we also bring it back home, and then we say, okay, like, what is this issue of white nationalism, right? If we're a civic nation in the United States, what do we call people who view it through the lens of, right, ethnic, racial, religious identity? And in fact, in recent years, I think as early as recent as 2020, the Department of Homeland Security had said that white nationalists were the top domestic terror threat to the United States. So this isn't just like me speaking on these issues, but I got really interested in it after following the fallout of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, which I believe was in summer. Was it 2017 now? Was it really that long ago? Um,
I think so.
So yeah, so I had been teaching about white nationalism kind of through that lens of Charlottesville since then 2018, because that would have been the first school year I think that I would have taught about that. So then I look at, right, I kind of bring those definitions together, and European colonialism, imperialism, and actually tie that back to then these issues with white nationalism in the United States, which at the time, included Dylan Roof and the shooting at the Black church in was that Charleston
Hmm.
then,
That's right.
and his influence by Rhodesia and by apartheid South Africa, right, and see kind of how those things actually do have connections to European history. And then there was the Christchurch, shooting at a mosque
New
uh,
Zealand.
in New
Yeah.
Zealand. Yep.
Right.
And
Hmm.
that was, live streamed broadcast mass murder influenced by the same things. And then just over the years, as I kept teaching this, right, that list of white nationalists mass murders would just grow, and so we began to ask that question, like, what is the unifying theme here too? And we began then to add synagogue shootings, all these other kinds of things, like how do great replacement theories, manifestos, sort of like what's the linkages between this international kind of web of white nationalism. So I would look at things through that lens, and to kind of bring things back to Charlottesville, then I would show them in their own words what white nationalists and white supremacists and neo-Nazis think, right? Because then I'm taking myself out of the equation. I'm not saying, here's what they're saying here. I just played for them this documentary from Vice called Charlottesville, Race and Hatred, I think, something like that. Race and Terror, which is still, I think, the best primary source piece of journalism on the events at Charlottesville. And yes, it's raw, it's terrifying, it's all those things. But I would try to preface all those conversations that I had for years with content warnings. I would post the previews on my school website for students to look at, for parents to see, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Never been
Well,
a big deal.
no, and I think this. I think what you're doing is what we history teachers regard as a conventionally productive approach to history instruction, which is let's see history through the lens of our own experiences as Americans. We as students and teachers to get us together to have a look at how this works and see it in a kind of comparative perspective. And having the students identify their own experiences with larger experiences taking place in the world. So what you're doing is a conventionally good approach to instruction, at least as most of us learned how to teach. Wouldn't you
Well,
agree?
thank you, because that's what I thought too, and I had
Yes.
I guess internalized that because I thought it was an incredibly effective unit. I always really enjoyed teaching it. Students were always incredibly engaged because it dealt with current events and modern topics, and not just the Prussian wars of expansion and German unification aren't that thrilling to high school sophomores, but you start to bring in primary sources about what's happening in Europe today. And of course, then this past spring, we could actually make connections to the Russian invasion of Ukraine
Yes.
and a lot of other things too. But well, part of the other reason too is just to give students a framework for thinking about white nationalism as a domestic terror threat, right? To be like, okay, here's this force that's active in the world. If I'm not somebody who's actively teaching about that inside a history class or inside the social studies classroom, where else are they going to get it? Well, they're going to get it in the same place where Dylan Roof was radicalized, where the Buffalo grocery supermarket shooter was radicalized. So I kind of eventually came to the approach of like, okay, what about this can kind of be an inoculation against that radical, so that way when young boys in particular see that kind of stuff online, they can know like, oh, hey, this is what Mr. Covington showed us in class. This is what we were talking about. These signs, these symbols, these kinds of things, they can be more savvy to the game. So to kind of bring it back to the video is that we showed it, I think it was like on a Friday, and it was like, okay, heads up, anybody, here's all the stuff that's going to be on this. There's going to be anti-gay slurs, there's going to be racial slurs. I mean, we're talking about Nazis here, right? Like
Right.
they
And
had
again,
all the context.
and
Yeah,
this
they had
is
all the,
spring of this year,
this
2022,
was
right?
spring 2021, mind you. Yeah.
2021.
So
Okay, I just wanted to be sure. Okay,
yeah. So I only had one
well, that's right.
student bow out, which was fine. I was like, hey, if you don't think you could handle it, just head in the hallway. It's 20 minutes long. Come back in. We'll be, part of the conversation. It was posted on my Google Classroom page at the time. So that way, students could always watch it on their own time or skip through parts that made them feel uncomfortable, et cetera. And of course, like it is uncomfortable. You're listening to Nazis say abhorrent Nazi things in, real time. And that's not for shock value. That's just to say, like any primary source, like we just need to understand like where are these people coming from? Like what is it that they're saying? Why do they want this white, ethno state? Why, what kind of signs and signals and kind of triggers do they have to try to get their message out there under the radar without swastikas and Confederate flags and those kinds of things. So that's all part of the conversation, understanding, decoding their kind of propaganda. So, of course, it's kind of tough, but we're like, okay, cool. We'll process this more on Monday, et cetera, et cetera. So I get an email in my inbox on Monday morning. It's like meeting about video used in class or something like that. And I go into this meeting. It was before school, or it was during my first hour plan period because I had first hour open. And apparently by the end of the day, there were, the way that my principal had made it seem is that there were just busloads of parents coming up to the building to complain, to I was told at one point that they wanted to go to the school board and have my license get suspended and sanctioned. All of these things because I played this video in class. Mind you, this is a video that I had shown since 2018. So in 2021 we would have been 3 years into this. Like I kind of had felt I'd found a rhythm, like it's an effective tool, etc. And when I was trying to explain to my principal, right, the justification for using this, because he's just like, well, why would you show this in a history class, right? Why would you show this in AP European history in the context of talking about current events? And I remember it very vividly because when he said this, I had my laptop with me, but it was closed. And I remember pausing. I said, hold on a second. And I popped open my laptop and wrote this quote down verbatim because he told me current events do not belong in history class. And I paused the meeting, wrote that quote down because at that point, it had broken my brain, right? I'd never heard that in my life. Nobody that I had ever talked to in the context of education and social studies education in particular, I think would side with that. Like that is a conversation that needs to be had. That's not something that you can just say at a one-off at a meeting and have that influence the way that, because that has big implications for the way that we're going to teach all the other history classes, not just mine,
Absolutely.
right?
Understood.
Because the government teacher is going to bring in show CNN 10 and bring in current events of how, hey, here's how the Senate is trying to pass this bill or whatever. We're in U.S. history. Here's this example of, geez, I don't even know. I'm kind of out of a loop here, but but it's the anchor point that kind of makes those teaching parts relevant and impactful for kids by making those modern
Right.
connections.
It's here's how we got here, and then you can look back and see the roots and branches of contemporary situations,
Yes,
and that's
exactly.
what
So
it is. Mhm.
So I left that meeting in particular and I was like, okay, well, my plan today is to process the stuff from Charlottesville from Friday. So I went ahead with that lesson plan, which was exactly like, how did that video make you feel? Right? What parts of it were shocking or surprising to you? Like, what can we do about that feeling? Right? Like neo-Nazis make people uncomfortable, but it's like, why is this important to know? And what can we do about this kind of going forward? And so I gathered student feedback and responses about that. We had a conversation. I felt like it went really well in every single class. Students were eager and engaged to just like have that conversation, process that stuff a little bit, and move on. Like then it was like, okay, we made the connection to white nationalism. I know it's tough. It's an important thing. And then we kind of went on with the rest of the curriculum, right? The very next day, I get called into a yet another meeting, like the very next day. And my principal he goes, you talked about Charlottesville again. And I was like, well, you didn't say I couldn't talk about Charlottesville again. Like we were in the middle of the lesson. And apparently some, he said that some students felt targeted by the way that by the way that I kept talking about this Charlottesville thing. And I was like, how did they feel singled out or targeted by this? Like, I only use like anonymous survey kind of information to guide a conversation. Students, we processed it as a large group. Nobody, said anything about this. I was like, how did anybody feel singled out or anything else like that? Well, it turns out, and this came out again later because we had follow-up meetings then with HR, because this is where this escalated to, where it appeared that the video that I had used in class appeared to portray President Trump in an unfavorable light because it had used his direct quotations in the wake of Charlottesville when he had said at that press conference, that good people on both sides kind of quote. He prevaricated on the issue of white nationalism and neo-Nazis rallying in Charlottesville and was, lambasted probably rightfully by the media and the American public. Now, that was not my take on it. I was playing President Trump in his own words. I was playing the neo-Nazis who were praising President Trump in their own words, right? Unprompted by by anybody in the media or by myself. So a bunch of things came out of that meeting then that probably made me think, oh, those were the same parents that were mad that I was teaching about January 6th. Those same parents were mad because I seemed to tweet about left-wing topics that included the Human Restoration Project, which is now where I work full-time. And we are not like a left-wing organization by any means, but it was pretty clear to me, and I communicated this to my principal that this was like a politically motivated thinking. And this was politically motivated behavior. And he was very adamant in the opposite direction that these were just concerned parents who wanted to do what was best for their kids. And I just remember talking with him over in these meetings to be like, I disagree with what the Nazis said, right? But I think it's still important to see because these people are active, causing violence and harm in our society. Um, and and so I was like, it's one thing to like take a disagreement with the content of the video because again, like I said, I disagree with it. But it's another thing to say like, oh well, I disagree that the Nazis are being portrayed in a negative way. Which is kind of where the line was crossed for me to say like, okay, the people who who don't like that I'm teaching about this must somehow be sympathetic to it. Is kind of where I got, and I never found out like until the very end of that school year, who the parent and who the it eventually ended up being just like one parent who was particularly upset about this.
Well,
But
maybe we
since
should pause and mhm.
yeah,
Well, maybe we
go
should
ahead.
talk just a little bit about that, and then I want to have you continue to talk about uh, the ultimate outcome when you left your position at Ankeny High School. But
Yeah.
it's interesting. So it seems to me that you were surveilled by parents, or at least at one parent, or by even one parent. But the principal was
Yes.
saying that that there was a whole quite a lot of parents who wanted to actually come in and protest against you and perhaps have your license suspended and that sort of thing. Um, Comment a little bit about your reflections on this what I'm calling surveillance, or parents looking at you and wanting to then actually attack or harass you, or let the administration know that they disapprove of how you're teaching, or more specifically what you're teaching. Do you have any reflections on that?
Yeah,
This
well, it eventually it escalated, right? Because then once this Charlottesville thing kind of tamped down, and I was never under any disciplinary kind of action there. Then the outside surveillance really ramped up because it kind of seemed like they didn't get me on this thing, so they're going to try to get me elsewhere. So
So
yeah,
when you say they, are you able to specify? I know there's an organization called Mama Bears in Ankeny, which
yes,
is basically, I think, two people who are
yes,
intent upon uh, confronting teachers, silencing teachers, chilling teachers who talk about race or other issues that they don't approve of inside the classroom. So I think it's important to try to pin down how many and who in particular is involved in such actions, who want to chill teachers who talk about race or gender or other important issues confronting Americans right now.
yeah.
So who
So
are they?
there is a connection to the Ankeny Mama Bears,
Okay.
which is a Google search away. But
Mhm. Okay.
it's it eventually it came down to like one parent. So I think whatever the previous numbers were overly hyped up, but one parent kind of had pursued this in my career then as a pet project, and then I think it escalated it to um, yeah, the she has connections to the Ankeny Mama Bears, which is an organization in Ankeny that originated really around the issue of masking in 2020 with the pandemic, and played, I would say, like a strong role, but it was like a peripheral role. Like they claimed to be very representative of the parent community, but were really only representative of a very loud and small, but vocal minority, who was against the mask mandates, social distancing, any of the changes, wanted business as usual, all these kinds of things. And eventually they elected school board members who voted in their favor. But that's a little bit later down the line. Um, but yeah, then it kind of escalated from what was happening in my classroom to then what was happening at the state policy level, what was happening in the right wing media ecosystem in Iowa at the time, because I think what was happening, around January 6th, 2021, in the spring when I'm teaching about the white nationalism stuff, there's really not a legal framework to attack me at the time to say, oh, well, you're teaching this, and that other thing, which is prohibited by law. Because it wasn't until, the summer of 2021 that Kim Reynolds signs House File 802. It wasn't until May of 2021 that, she signed the bill that I think it both prohibited the masking in schools issue, which the Ankeny Mama Bears were right there by Kim Reynolds' side in that conversation. There are pictures of Kimberly Reichs and Emily Peterson from Ankeny standing with Kim Reynolds, and Kim Reynolds heaping praise on them. Um, but she also signed a bill that required the Pledge of Allegiance to be said in schools, which I think most schools were doing, but she made it a law. By law, it had to be read, and I took a pretty vigorous stance against that as a state policy, and that got elevated into the right wing media ecosystem. So there's a direct link, I think, from the Ankeny Mama Bears kind of being a conduit for that, and Ankeny sort of being ground zero for this kind of behavior, then to connections like the Iowa Standard, which is the biggest right wing, blog in the state of Iowa. Maybe even just the biggest political blog in Iowa of any kind of stripe. They really elevated the piece. I kind of became a regular featured guest on their blog materials. If you go to the Iowa Standard and search for Nick Covington, you'll find probably half a dozen articles about me on there. And then the Iowa Young Republicans picked up something and tried to pick fights about this too. So this was all like at the end of the school year and over the summertime when there was really nothing, about schools that they could really be upset about. But yeah, then Kimberly Reichs found my name on some right-wing aggregator who was pulling names from the Zin Ed. So the Zin Ed project had a Teach the Truth pledge, which was like, now that states were starting to pass these divisive concepts laws and ban critical race theory and all these things, it was like, hey, teachers, sign up, stand in solidarity that we pledge to teach the truth. And I signed it. Some right-wing sites pulled the list of names, compiled them, and made them searchable by your state. And lo and behold, she pulls it up and screenshots it next to a picture of next to a screenshot of my school picture, my school website, and says, "Hey, Ankeny, fire this clown." And there's another stream of hate that kind of followed. So, yeah, then headed into
a stream of hate directed toward you.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yep. One of the comments on her post actually read, "Tell him he will have to give up his job to a black person who is superior to him in all ways." So a bunch of racist hate, coming from that. And yeah, then there was like the social media surveillance. So headed into the next year. So this would have been like the 21-22 school year. A lot of meetings about people sending my principal, basically annotated bibliographies of my tweets, where they would have like a table, and on the one hand be a link to tweets, timestamps of tweets, and here's like a list of why I don't like it or board policies I think that it breaks.
So to be clear, they're bombarding your principal not infrequently with messages, with derogatory messages about you. Is this right?
Yes, I would
Okay.
say daily, if not weekly. I remember for several weeks having weekly meetings with my admin about this, to the point where I said, I'm not meeting about this topic anymore. I said, if there's some board policy that I'm violating, then you can let me know. But I'm not having a weekly check-in about the content of my tweets. There were things like, I've been critical of the College Board, which runs the advanced placement program. And, one of the complaints about my Twitter account was that, like, should somebody who's teaching AP be this critical of the College Board and blah, blah, like they were just editorializing about, the things that I'm saying outside, tweeting from my bed at 9:30 p.m. just because I'm fired up about something online. I can say those things and teach my AP class perfectly fine. And they also, I don't know, it was really bizarre. They would send my principal things that I would retweet, and they would say like, oh, he was sending this stuff at this time when he should have been teaching class. And it was actually something that somebody else had said, and it wasn't me. They just didn't understand how Twitter worked. I don't know. It was very
But
bizarre.
again, come back to the notion of they and who are they. It seems that you're being watched very assiduously, that you're being surveilled,
Yeah.
and somebody's taking time to do these things. And I think that's an important point to bring home. So I
Yeah.
just wanted to add that to the conversation or emphasize it. I don't,
Yeah.
but please keep going.
No, and I had learned, I didn't really learn the identity of who that frequent emailer was. Um, because my principal didn't really tell me these things. He'd be like, it's not important who it is. Okay, maybe that's true. But he said that because I was like, is it a parent of somebody that I have? Because all I wanted to do this whole time is just like, let's just sit down and have a meeting about this.
Yeah,
Let's just
I
talk
would
about what
disagree.
you
I
think is
think it is
happening.
important to know who it is.
Yeah, not so
You're
the
being
concern was that I was,
you're being
yeah.
publicly attacked, and I think that the person who's attacking you should be known. They should be public about it. So go ahead. Excuse me.
Yeah, no, the concern was they were like, well, if you know, then you're going to take punitive action against, if it's a student in the school. And that's not my MO at all. My MO is understanding, to be like, help me short circuit whatever the game of telephone is coming from your student to you to whatever, because there's mixed signals happening here. Like they were, the politically motivated thinking was causing them to, you know, see things in context and in ways that where they were not, or portray me as this like indoctrination machine, where that's absolutely not the case. But I never got the chance to do that because I didn't find out who this was. Well, I did learn that the person sending this, annotated bibliography didn't even have a student in my building. They weren't the parent of anybody in there. They were just like a concerned Ankeny parent who had taken it upon themselves to do this work. So I don't know if that was an organized attempt or if it was something else. But yeah, so it started to actually impact then the way that I would communicate on social media, and the way that I would share my work, and the way that I would do these things. And then it started to have a chilling effect on actually how like how we taught our courses. So the first time that this really came out was for our U.S. history course. They had used since Ava DuVernay's Selma had come out. They had used Selma kind of as an anchor for learning about the course of the civil rights movement. So
Yeah,
they would
the,
watch the film in
a much
clips,
admired
and
film about Martin Luther King.
yes, yeah. So they would watch the chunks of it and then kind of like learn like, okay, here's what's happening here. Let's read the primary source. Let's learn about the actual context. Let's see what's going on as they kind of go through that story. And for the first time that I was aware of, they had, because I was not teaching U.S. history then this past year, but they had actually gone through and made a list. They had a 1-page list with all the timestamps of every single, like racial epithet that was used, like in the context of Selma, especially. Like, here's the language that's used to uphold white supremacy. Is kind of how I view it. It's not doing it in a way that's salacious or like obscene or trying to think like in a way that's not out of context, right? Like kids would hear that language in the hallways. They would hear it in popular music, but it was like the only place. Yeah, go ahead.
Or just to be clear, so as as a result of your experiences with parents who are disapproving of your instructional content and approach, perhaps this was beginning to have an effect on your colleagues who are teaching American history. Is this correct? Who are beginning
Yes.
to be concerned about a kind of what they regarded as a valuable lesson and a tool for engaging students, which would be this very much praised film about Selma and about Martin Luther King. And so they're beginning to
Yes.
have second thoughts about using this particular approach, right? Or using this
Yes.
content in ways that you're describing now as very precise and very carefully done. Is this correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because I had kept them apprised of everything happening to me. I mean, they were very well aware of everything that was happening to me, and I've spoken openly, and I've spoken at school board meetings, so they know what's going on. And they didn't want it to happen to them. So, yeah, so there was the list of all of the timestamps where they're supposed to mute or fast forward through these things, and I my perspective of that is like understanding, right, not wanting to propagate the use of such racial slurs or anything else. Like, I completely understand that. At the same time, in this historical context, we need to understand how these are used to uphold white supremacy. So when we hear them out in the wild, we can understand it through that context, and not through um not through a popular context that they might otherwise hear, on the school bus, or in popular music online or whatever. Like, understand that when you use this language, you uphold white supremacy, right? White Ankeny students. I think that is appropriate. I think there's a debate that's up for debate, but in my opinion, that's appropriate. Now,
I think it's a
um,
widely shared value among Americans that we don't want to have a racist society and that we
yeah,
want to try to instruct young people in ways that will inhibit and begin to erode racist attitudes and dispositions. I don't see who would ever see that as controversial.
yeah.
So I don't. So why it would be a space for debate, I'm not quite sure. But I'm
Yeah.
sure others might
And
disagree, as you suggest.
and odd that this would be the first time again since that movie had come out that they had been using it as a source, that they would feel compelled to censor it in such a way. So I thought that that was pretty coincidental timing on that front. So I was approached because I have been, so outspoken at school board meetings, on social media, and elsewhere, just as I've become the target of this, that I got approached by a former Des Moines Register reporter who was working for Axios, Lynn Ta, and she just wanted to see, hey, has in February of 2022, so now we're reaching the present year here. She reached out and said, like, has the divisive concepts law, has that impacted the way that you're teaching about Black History Month? And I was like, well, not really Black History Month per se, but our civil rights unit, yeah. And I shared with her that exact story. And that showed up in Axios, alongside something from a Republican legislator who said, like, oh, it shouldn't have this chilling effect, yada yada. Even though here's my concrete example.
Please continue. You were talking about Axios as a place that began to pick up on your story as they tried to understand what was going on in terms of teaching during Black History Month. Do I have that right?
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
So it would have been February 2022. I talked to Lynn in the Target parking lot. I
That's
just
your
had a phone
that's your
call.
that's your colleague Lynn Garner. Is this right?
No, this would be Lynn Ta. So this is the journalist, the
Oh,
former
Lynn Talk. Excuse me. Uh huh.
Yes, no. So Lynn Ta is a former Des Moines Register journalist who then works for Axios. Axios, big national, news kind of
Okay.
aggregator. They kind of do short form pieces, go into a little bit less detail, but um, yeah. So I just explained to her exactly what I explained to you right now, and she kind of compiled those into some bullet points on the Axios piece, and a piece come out that said, teaching Black History Month under Iowa's new law. And I was featured as, a social studies teacher at Ankeny High School. And here's the issue with Selma. Well, as a result of that piece, I actually began to get contacted by some editors and some people working on pieces elsewhere, in a similar vein, to be like, hey, would you be willing to come on and talk about these things, yada yada. And there wasn't to an extent where I was going to actually go and do some more pieces and do some more reporting on that issue, but I wanted to get the permission of my colleagues to go ahead and do that. And initially I had that, and then once kind of the once the aftermath of the story went through, they got cold feet and pulled out and didn't want anything to do with any of this. Because what happened is that I got pulled into a meeting shortly after that with my admin and with HR, and I was made to take an unpaid day of leave, and got a letter in my file about breaking the communications policy for talking with this reporter instead of going through the Ankeny communications department or whatever, right? Which I didn't know was a policy. I figured, oh, I'm going to talk to this journalist about the way that it's impacting, teaching in the classroom. So it kind of made it seem like the only people who can't talk about the issues that are facing in their classroom are actually teachers. Parents can talk about it, policymakers can talk about it, but the second a journalist reaches out to a classroom teacher and they say what they're supposed to do, they say their lived experience of how they're teaching these things, then it becomes a disciplinary issue. So,
Right. Yeah, right. And so we again see a kind of chilling effect uh, that's at work here in this whole situation process from your colleagues being getting cold feet in support of you to the word getting out. I'm sure that you shouldn't be talking to the press about such issues and concerns.
and then it was actually a real short. It was only a couple weeks after that. So, I by this point in the year leading up to that, I'd had a dozen meetings with my administrator about BS issues that just were resolved. And this case really like escalated things to the issue of discipline really for the first time. Again, a day of unpaid leave is not nothing. It's a day away from the classroom. That's a day that they took out of my paycheck for talking with a journalist. So it cost me real money, right? And cost me time with my students. Well, a couple of weeks later, I get called into another admin meeting. This time it's about social media. And really this time, so like in the wake of the social media use, social media conversations in the fall, because I was being watched so closely, I had pretty like tight reins about like, okay, Nick, here's the rules about when you can do stuff on social media. Well, in February is also when the invasion of Ukraine happened. So really the frontline place to learn about that was really on Twitter, right? And because you could follow world leaders, you could follow accounts on the ground with videos of tanks streaming across the border, videos of bombings, in Kiev and all these things too. So I was actively using social media at the time to try and figure out how the hell am I going to teach about the invasion of Ukraine to my AP European history class.
Well,
So again, this issue
yeah.
of current events, social media is kind of this perfect storm. In my admin, again, I'm kind of laughing now only because I've been in therapy for 6 months, but not a person who should be working in the complex human endeavor of education, because he can't see these scales of gray and kind of understand how to deal with people rather than managing spreadsheets. But he took the things that I had said on my social media about trying to learn more about the Ukrainian invasion, and sharing things about about the invasion of Ukraine on my social media account during the school day. Took those as being a violation of this social media policy, and we had a big conversation then at that point in February about what's the proper role of PLCs, and I was like, hey, Pete, when you have a question, you get to go down the hallway and you get to talk to, you have an admin team, or you can email other principals, or you can do this, that. I am the only AP European history teacher in my building, and my PLC happens to exist on the internet, and I prefer to connect with them there during the school day. So during my plan time, I'm trying to learn more about these topics from experts and other educators, so that way I can feel comfortable about teaching them in my classroom. And that's how I use technology to advance my professional practice. And again, his discomfort with this really just led things to be. Let's just say by the end of that meeting, I had another letter in my file, and
Mm-hmm.
and I told him that I would need the rest of the day off. I told him that he, for the last year, he's been trying to put me in a box that I would never fit into, whether it's pedagogically or personally, or in whatever regard. He kind of made me a pet project in a way that made my career trajectory in Ankeny really untenable and unsustainable. Because the way that the progressive discipline system works is that, right, you get the one unpaid day, you get letters in your file, and those only accumulate from there. There's no, even if even if there's a new principal, even if there's new something else, you're still on that progressive disciplinary scale. So if a year later I get something else down the line that somebody complains about, then it's another letter, more unpaid time off, suspensions, firings, etc. So I went home on February 25th, 2022, and I penned my resignation letter, and I submitted it on the employee whatever access center. I emailed my principal, and his response was to say, thanks for letting us know, Nick. We'll wait until you've told your colleagues to post your position. 10 years after 10 years in Ankeny. So,
Well,
yeah,
well, I want to talk a little bit about with you about the reactions to your resignation.
yeah,
I know that you had the support of some students. I think I read in the Ankeny Talon, that's the Ankeny student
yeah.
newspaper, that the reporter there at least made mention of a student walkout in your support.
Yeah.
Can you talk to me a little bit about reactions of students and perhaps
Yeah.
colleagues or others?
Colleagues, I think, had seen it coming. They kind of saw the writing on the wall. I mean, they were surprised as anything, but students were the hardest, because I decided immediately to I'm just going to rip that Band-Aid off the next Monday. Cause I think it was like a Thursday or Friday, I took the day off and wrote that. Came in on Monday and I just told every successive class, hey, here's this, here's this. And
Well, what
it
did
was
you
the
say to them?
hardest.
Be a bit more specific. I mean, did you tell them that why you were leaving, or and that
I didn't.
the
They
pressures you
they
felt?
they guessed. They guessed
Okay.
pretty quickly
Mhm.
because at that point our admin was not very well liked by a lot of people. But yeah, I said, hey, I just need to let you all know, this is going to be my last year at Ankeny, and I won't be coming back in the spring. Which was devastating for my sophomores, especially because I think they were planning on having me for econ as a senior and getting to kind of have me throughout their high school experience because those relationships are something that I really value. But yeah, over the course of the semester, things came out, and I talked more openly about it, and then I think it was finally with the Buffalo, grocery shooting that looked, exactly like the Christchurch shooting, looked exactly like the Dylan Roof shooting. I wrote a piece. I published it, explaining everything that I just had explained to you. It kind of went viral.
And that
People
was that
about,
first in the Iowa starting. Excuse me, in the Bleeding Heartland publication.
you know
Is that
what?
right?
I had originally just published it to my own blog, like on Medium, because I just needed to get it out there. I shared it. It went. I think people all around Iowa, around the country, I got a lot of parent and student feedback, all supportive, all positive about everything, and most of the feedback was, I had no idea this was happening. If I would have known, I would have done or said something. And yeah, the students were just kind of aghast that such a thing was allowed to go on behind the scenes, and nobody really knew the extent of the harassment from parents, the constant intervention from administration, all of that stuff. Because yeah, it eventually just comes down to like who's allowed to talk about these issues, and the message is clear. Like anybody who is being critical of the narratives of white nationalism and white supremacy, of the growing fascist voices, authoritarian voices, who want to deny the results of elections and increasingly want to target trans students, and trans Americans. That those are the voices that get silenced, and as the conversation shifted even in Ankeny, the last thing that really had happened at Ankeny was this issue about drag shows. So Ankeny's just like walked lockstep alongside these culture war issues where, at first it was about masks and COVID. And then once they moved on past that, it became CRT and teaching about race and everything else. And then they forgot what the hell CRT was and went right to, the drag shows and the Gay Straight Alliance Club and all of that stuff. So I kind of found myself standing up at the end of my career there in the springtime, actually, being a LGBTQ ally for the students who were targeted by those efforts as well.
Hmm.
So
And right, and I think uh, I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about sort of how this weighed on you psychologically, or in terms of your sense of well-being, um, how it what it meant to your family. Do you
yeah,
mind sharing some things about that?
yeah. I mean, I think um, I I never really took took the took like the conflict and the consternation like terribly personally. Like I'm 6'4", I'm a big tall white dude. I'm not really physically intimidated. I'm pretty savvy online. So I never really took the online harassment super seriously. My wife would say things like, oh no, you made the crazies mad again, didn't you? Or she'd kind of have offhand comments, be like, just as long as they don't come to the house, and nothing like that had ever happened. But there was just the constant draining of like, well, when is the next shoe going to drop? When is the next thing going to happen? When is and there were a lot of sleepless nights, a lot of days off of work that were either the result of meetings that I had had in the morning and didn't really feel like in the headspace to teach that day. Um, and it just grinds away on you over time. And really, especially one of the big reasons why I felt like I had to get out was because like I didn't know who I was like by the end of my career. Like I thought I had arrived in this place where it was like, okay, I've got this rhythm. I've been in this context. I've been in leadership for 10 years, in the district and all these various roles. Like here I am, this trusted, experienced, teacher in the system that has good relationships with students, parents, throughout the throughout those 10 years, and just to have that all thrown back in my face and just be treated like I was nothing,
Hmm.
like I was disposable,
Hmm.
and that I wasn't capable of making those professional decisions. And behind the scenes, I still was a leader in driving those conversations in the social studies between our admin about, well, what does it mean to teach current events, and why is this such a vital part? And um, you know, but I guess to get back to the mental health thing, then once I stepped out in June, um, that's kind of when reality hit. It was like, oh God, I really got to shift my mindset because, and so I did. I got into therapy, and I was actually in a group therapy for burnout, for professional
Hmm.
burnout, and
Hmm.
I would be listening to these people talk about their roles in programming and computer science and in all of these what I would consider like high stress, high prestige jobs, and I'd be like, oh, that's me. Oh, that's me. Oh, that's me. I feel that same thing. And talking with my own therapist about things then, and telling her that like at a certain point I thought about getting a PTSD diagnosis. Like I was joking about this, right? But I was like, I consider PTSD something that I read about, it's shell shock, right, in World War I memoirs, or I in it, as the result of battlefield experiences. And she was just like, no, like you are checking all those marks for post-traumatic stress, because of your experiences in school. So I didn't think I realized it at the time, but you know I think there was just that stress and shock of waiting for the next thing to fall, of the constant anxiety of wondering, can I teach this topic in this particular way? Oh, well, I've done this before, but now I got to. So, like my last year, I didn't end up showing the Charlottesville video because I was like, I'm not dealing with that again. I'm not dealing with this, that, or the other thing. Like, once I submitted my resignation, I kind of, I was like, I'm going to be real careful about picking my battles because I don't have any
Hmm.
more energy left in the tank to fight
Right.
by the end of the year.
Right. So again, the intervention, the surveillance, the chilling effects of this of all that besieged you, which is getting more powerful and more forceful, and even enshrined in legislation in Iowa, as you've pointed out. Um, you've now uh, are with the Human Restoration Project, and I think that represents an organization that seeks to find ways to fight back against these forces and to ameliorate the stresses that they demand on, or that they place upon people. So, as you think about, well, tell us a little about the Human Restoration Project, if you would, and which I think seems to be a good fit for you, coming off of your teaching experiences. And besides recording this really valuable interview, and I thank you so much for all that you've said, I'm interested in how we can mobilize to fight back, how we can use your story and other stories to begin to uh, to be empowered by these stories in order to take organized action, have political formations that can push back against uh, those who would chill and silence teachers and interfere with best practices in the name of indoctrination and rather than fostering of critical thinking. So, uh, tell us a little bit about the Human Restoration Project, and also if you have anything to say about how to fight back or how to confront
Yeah,
these forces, which I think are unhealthy for education. Please share your thoughts.
certainly. So I think to put the culture wars in context, like those things, the culture war, I think, is maybe not explicitly in the way that it is waged, but certainly in its outcomes, right? It's meant to be this what we would call like this grievance industrial complex, right? Where it's just meant to capture all of your time, capture all of your attention, right? We're going to feed people to it. We're going to feed organizations to it. We're going to feed school districts to it. And it's going to be the only thing that we focus on. Just this negative kind of a dead end agenda, which is just constantly relitigating books and what are we going to teach about this about slavery and all these other kinds of relitigating all of these past conflicts. And I think what that does is that precludes us from actually building a positive agenda for our kids, for schools, for education. And in a way, right, stepping away from the classroom meant that I could actually step out of that like bog of negativity, which is what it was, because you're just constantly in a space of survival. And when you're just trying to focus on getting to the next day or getting to the next thing, like you're not imagining what's possible in the future. And that's what was so refreshing to step away from the classroom into this work then is that that's exactly what this work does. That's what I do all day now is I just try to imagine like what could the possibilities be, like what could we be doing, like what, because I believe that classrooms and schools are just like such awesome, like in the literal sense of the word, like sacred spaces where we have huge opportunities to work with young people, community. Like it can be a force multiplier for the best parts of what society and systems and people working together have to provide. But it's like in my work as a social studies teacher, I was so trapped in that culture war, that negative feedback loop. And that's what they keep everybody trapped in, because that's all that parents focus on, right? Not what is the positive agenda that I want to build relationships with and, like imagine better for the future. It's no, we got to investigate what books are in the library, or we gotta send the principal Mr. Covington's Twitter account or something like that. Um, and so, yeah, to step back and really take inventory and be like, well, what is the positive agenda for education? Like, I think that's really the crisis that we're in right now, which is we don't have any clue what education is actually for, and the people who are trying to give us those answers are don't have any interest in the product, right? It's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy for policymakers, particularly in Iowa, like with the Iowa GOP and with the right-wing media ecosystem, because there's no incentive for them to see these things succeed, right? If education succeeds in a positive, productive, helpful way that leads to better outcomes for society and for young people and families and kids and communities, well, that's a net negative for them, because then that's less rage, grievance bait for them. So yeah, what the Human Restoration Project does, and my involvement kind of goes back to 2019. Just it was less than part-time, so it was just a hobby, a side project. But we incorporated it in 2020 as an educational nonprofit. Basically, our perspective is that the top-down ed reform movements of the last 20 years have failed, right? Like think No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, all of these things that tried to um, implement top-down reforms based on competition, based on standardized test scores, based on value-added measures, school closures, charter schools, voucher programs. All of those things have failed to produce the test score boosts that they thought were going to be the result of this, but B, have actually led to the diminishing professionalization of teaching as a profession. They've led to a mental health crisis amongst young people. And really, again, like the atomization of the purpose of education, where we've seen now the the Secretary of Education tweet things out where the purpose of education is, to serve industry in creating the next generation of workers kinds of ideas. So our
rather than.
imagination is completely
Mhm,
impoverished of what we imagine education is for.
mhm.
So all I was going to say then is like we just say like let's just step back and we think about four things. So basically, we just want to rebuild from the grassroots, which involves partnerships with students, parents, teaching as a profession, building coalitions with educators for the purpose of four things. That learning is rooted in purpose finding and community relevance. So really, just like centering a path to purpose and helping students find purpose and meaning in their work. That social justice is the cornerstone to educational success. So that's not only, anti-bias, anti-racism kind of work, but that's also just creating inclusive spaces for neurodivergent students, people with disabilities, and then critical pedagogy, democratic kind of schools to, build models for what we want the rest of the world to look like outside of school, rather than, preparing students for life in the 21st century job force or whatever the thing might be. Well, how can we prepare the job force, or how can we prepare the workplace for our students, right? Like, so kind of
Yes.
flip the script. Then,
Hmm.
like, address dehumanizing practices. So dehumanizing practices that don't belong in schools. So we really look at, disciplinary practices. This is restorative kind of practices, restorative justice space, but also redefining assessment, testing, grades, homework, and some of those, kind of on the ground fundamental practices. And then also looking at learners are respectful toward each other's innate human worth. So not not sort of the Khan Academy version where kids are just, scrolling through watching videos online as their education, but really what Paulo Freire might call an education of the word and the world together, kind of a
Hmm.
John Dewey
Hmm.
esque vision for community partnerships, a lot of project based work, authentic work out in the world with that too, but also ensuring a thriving public education as well. So, really having that debate about the public sphere. What are the values that we bring to the table in public education, and how can we help protect them for the next generation?
Hmm. Well, those are, in my view, valuable goals and ambitions. I'm glad you're really involved in them. That you've found a place to land to continue your instructional activities. That's great. So, with that, Nick, I'll let you go. Thanks so much for taking time to speak with me, and I hope these comments are widely shared that you've made, because they're valuable indeed. So, thanks very much, and look forward to further conversations with you in the future. Thanks,
All
Nick.
right. Well, thanks, Bruce. Yeah.
You bet.